Sarah Johnson stood before the imposing granite steps of the Good Marshall Courthouse, her heart racing beneath her neatly pressed cotton dress. The year was 1952, and the morning sun cast long shadows across lower Manhattan, painting the courthouse's classical columns in stark relief. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine ascending those steps not as an observer, but as an attorney, briefcase in hand, arguments prepared, ready to fight for justice. But dreams had boundaries in 1952, especially for a young black woman from Harlem. "Girl, what you doing standing there?" A gruff voice startled her from her reverie. The white security guard's hand rested meaningfully on his baton. "These steps ain't for loitering." Sarah straightened her spine, summoning the dignity her mother had instilled in her since childhood. "I'm here for the clerical position at Harrison Schmidt, sir. 4th floor." The guard's face softened marginally. A black woman seeking secretarial work fit neatly into his worldview. He jerked his thumb toward the entrance. Through security, then straight to the elevator. As Sarah navigated the courthouse's marble corridors, her sensible shoes clicking against the floor, she carried with her the weight of a dream that seemed impossible. She'd graduated summa cum laude from Howard University with a degree in English, her mind sharp as a razor and her determination even sharper. But every law school application had been met with the same response. "We regret to inform you." The rejection letters hadn't surprised her. They were merely confirmation of what everyone already knew. In each OR, the number of black women lawyers in the entire United States could be counted on 2 hands. Most law schools either explicitly barred black students or used unofficial quotas to keep their numbers minimal. For women, the barriers were even higher. Harrison Schmidt occupied most of the courthouse's 4th floor, its reception area a testament to old money and older power. Dark wooden panels lined the walls, and leather-bound law books filled floor-to-ceiling shelves. The clicking of typewriters provided a steady percussion to the hushed conversations behind closed doors. "Mrs. Johnson?" The receptionist, a white woman with perfectly coiffed gray hair, peered at her over half-moon spectacles. "Mr. Harrison will see you now." William Harrison I proved to be exactly what Sarah expected. Silver-haired, Brooks Brothers suit, the kind of man whose family name appeared on building cornerstones. He barely glanced up from her application as she sat ramrod straight in the leather chair before his massive desk. "Your typing speed is excellent," he noted, "and your references from Howard are quite impressive. Though I must say, it's unusual for someone with your background to have such academic achievements." Sarah kept her face carefully neutral, though her fingers twisted the handle of her purse. "I believe in making the most of every opportunity, Mr. Harrison." "Indeed." He finally looked at her properly, his pale blue eyes analytical. "Tell me, Mrs. Johnson, why would someone with your qualifications want a simple clerical position?" The question was a trap, and they both knew it. To admit her true ambitions would be to end the interview immediately. To deny them would be to betray everything she believed in. Sarah chose her words with surgical precision. "I've always been fascinated by the law, Mr. Harrison. The opportunity to work in a prestigious firm like Harrison Schmidt, even in a clerical capacity, would be invaluable experience." A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Fascinating indeed." He closed her file with a decisive snap. "You understand, of course, that this position involves handling sensitive documents. Discretion is paramount." "Of course, sir. And you would be expected to maintain a certain professional distance from our clients." The subtext was clear. "Don't get ideas about building your own connections or clientele." "I understand completely." Harrison nodded, satisfied. "Very well. You'll start Monday at 8 sharp. Miss Peters at reception will handle the paperwork." As Sarah left the office, her heart was pounding for a different reason now. She had done it, secured a position at one of New York's most prestigious law firms. It wasn't as a lawyer, not yet, but it was a foot in the door. And sometimes that's all you needed. That evening, as she rode the subway back to Harlem, Sarah pulled a small notebook from her purse. In it, She had meticulously copied down the names of every black lawyer she could find in New York City. There weren't many. But what caught her eye was the blank space beneath them, space waiting to be filled with new names, new possibilities. At home, in the small apartment she shared with her younger sister Ruby, Sarah carefully hung up her best dress and sat down at the kitchen table. Ruby was working the night shift at the hospital, training to be a nurse, fighting her own battles against prejudice and limitation. Sarah opened a heavy law book she'd borrowed from the public library. The words of Supreme Court Justice Benjamin Cardozo stared back at her. The law is not a series of calculating machines where answers come tumbling out when you insert the problem. No, Sarah thought, it wasn't. The law was alive, breathing, changing. And she would change with it, learn it, master it, even if she had to do so in secret, in the shadows of a system that wasn't built for her. She began to read, making careful notes in her cramped handwriting. Outside her window, Harlem was coming alive with the sounds of evening jazz from the club down the street, children playing in the gathering dusk, the distant rumble of elevated trains. But Sarah barely noticed. She was already deep in the intricacies of contract law, building her knowledge piece by piece, preparing for a future that seemed impossible to everyone except her. In the margins of her notebook, she wrote a simple phrase: per aspera ad astra, through hardships to the stars. It would become her mantra in the years ahead, a reminder that every closed door was simply an invitation to find another way through. The clock struck midnight, but Sarah kept reading. She had taken the first step on a long journey, and there was no turning back now. In the quiet of her kitchen, surrounded by law books and dreams, a revolution was beginning, not with speeches or protests, but with the quiet determination of one woman who refused to accept the limitations others had placed upon her. Little did she know that this was just the beginning of a story that would challenge not just her own future, but the very foundations of a system that had stood unchanged for generations. The summer of 1952 melted into autumn, and Sarah Johnson settled into a routine at Harrison Schmidt. Each morning, she arrived precisely at 7:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the official start time, using those precious moments to organize her thoughts and prepare for the day ahead. But more importantly, those quiet minutes gave her the opportunity to study the case files that had been left out for filing from the previous day. Sarah's desk sat in a corner of the firm's library, a position that the other secretaries viewed as undesirable due to its isolation and distance from the office's social center. But for Sarah, it was perfect. Surrounded by towering shelves of law books, she could immerse herself in legal text during lunch breaks or whenever the attorneys were in court. She developed a system of taking shorthand notes that looked like routine clerical work to anyone passing by, but were actually detailed analyses of the cases she encountered. One rainy October morning, Sarah was typing up correspondence for Mr. Schmidt when she noticed something unusual in a property dispute case. The argument the firm was preparing seemed to overlook a crucial precedent from a 1937 New York State Supreme Court decision. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the typewriter keys. Speaking up could be dangerous, but remaining silent felt wrong. After a sleepless night, she decided to take a risk. She carefully typed up a memo, attributing her observation to a filing cross-reference, and slipped it into the case file. 3 days later, she overheard Schmidt telling Harrison about the lucky catch that had saved them from an embarrassing oversight. Remarkable how these things turn up in the filing system, Schmidt mused. Sarah kept her head down, hiding a small smile behind her typing. As autumn progressed, Sarah developed an ingenious system for her clandestine legal education. She created a network of borrowed knowledge. Duplicate copies of case files she took home to study, law books she carefully signed out for filing purposes, and notes from attorney meetings she was supposed to transcribe, but instead used as impromptu lectures. At home, her kitchen table became a makeshift law school. Ruby, now understanding her sister's ambitions, helped create cover stories for Sarah's late-night studies. They transformed their apartment into a secret academy. Law books hidden behind cookbooks, case notes disguised as grocery lists, and legal precedents memorized while washing dishes. "You're playing a dangerous game, Sarah," Ruby warned one night, watching her sister pore over a complex tort law case. What if they catch you? Sarah looked up from her notes, her eyes tired but determined. They can't catch me learning, Ruby. Knowledge doesn't belong to them exclusively. But the pressure of her double life began to take its toll. Dark circles appeared under her eyes, and her hands sometimes trembled from exhaustion. Yet each small victory, every legal principle mastered, every case understood, gave her renewed strength. Her breakthrough came unexpectedly. One of the firm's junior partners, Robert Friedman, had a habit of thinking aloud while reviewing cases. Sarah noticed that he often paced in the library near her desk, muttering about legal strategies. She began timing her filing work to coincide with his sessions, absorbing his inadvertent tutorials like a sponge. Friedman, a Jewish lawyer who had faced his own share of discrimination, seemed to sense something in Sarah beyond her clerical abilities. He began leaving increasingly complex cases on her desk for filing, sometimes with specific passages marked. Whether this was intentional or coincidental, Sarah never knew, but she seized every opportunity for learning that came her way. As 1953 approached, Sarah's understanding of the law grew exponentially. She could recite the elements of a valid contract, explain the difference between negligence and gross negligence, and analyze the constitutional implications of landmark civil rights cases. Her notebook collection expanded to fill a hidden compartment under her bed, each volume filled with carefully reasoned legal arguments and case analyses. But knowledge alone wasn't enough. Sarah began to understand that the law wasn't just about memorizing cases and statutes. It was about understanding people, their motivations, their struggles, and their rights. She started paying attention to the human stories behind the legal documents she handled. The elderly widow fighting eviction, the small business owner battling insurance companies, the workers seeking compensation for injuries. One December afternoon, as snow fell softly outside the courthouse windows, Sarah overheard two senior partners discussing a pro bono case they were reluctantly handling. It involved a black family from Harlem being forced out of their home through discriminatory housing practices that were technically legal but morally reprehensible. That evening, Sarah stayed late, ostensibly to catch up on filing. Once the office was empty, she pulled out the case file and began to study it intensively. Over the next week, she spent every spare moment researching similar cases, looking for patterns, precedents, and possible arguments. She discovered that while the specific housing practice was legal, the way it had been applied could be challenged under New York state law. The revelation excited her so much that she almost forgot herself and spoke up during a partner meeting. Instead, she channeled her insight into another carefully worded filing note. 2 weeks later, the firm won the case using an argument remarkably similar to Sarah's notes. The family kept their home, and Harrison Schmidt received positive publicity for their pro bono work. Sarah celebrated quietly at her desk, allowing herself a small moment of pride. It was her first real victory in the law, even if no one knew it. As the year drew to a close, Sarah made an important discovery about herself. She was no longer just playing at being a lawyer, she was thinking like one. The transformation had been gradual but profound. Every document she typed, every conversation she overheard, every legal text she studied in secret had contributed to this metamorphosis. In her hidden notebook, she wrote, "The law is not just words on paper. It's a living thing, shaped by those who dare to challenge it, change it, make it better. One day, I will do more than watch from the shadows. One day, I will stand in the light and speak the words that need to be spoken." That New Year's Eve, as fireworks exploded over Harlem and the city celebrated, Sarah Johnson sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by her secret library of legal knowledge. She was no longer just dreaming of becoming a lawyer. She was becoming one, page by page, case by case, in the shadows of a system that never expected her to rise so high. Spring 1954 arrived in Harlem with a surge of hope and change. The air was thick with anticipation as the Supreme Court deliberated on Brown v. Board of Education, and Sarah Johnson felt the winds of change stirring in her own life as well. It began one Sunday after church at Abyssinian Baptist Church, where Sarah had been a member since childhood. Mrs. Eleanor Washington, an elderly congregation member, approached her with trembling hands clutching a stack of papers. "Child, I heard you work at one of them big law firms downtown," Mrs. Washington said, her voice quavering. "These people, they're trying to take my house. I don't understand all these papers they keep sending." Sarah gently took the documents, recognizing immediately the predatory lending practices that had become all too common in their community. The contract was deliberately complex, designed to confuse and exploit. Her blood boiled, but her voice remained calm. "Let me look these over for you, Mrs. Washington. Sometimes these documents just need a careful eye." That evening, Sarah spread the papers across her kitchen table. What she found was worse than she'd initially suspected: hidden clauses, escalating interest rates, and terms that virtually guaranteed foreclosure. But she also found hope: several violations of New York state lending laws that could invalidate the entire contract. Using her knowledge from Harrison Schmidt's similar cases, Sarah spent the next week drafting a letter challenging the contract's validity. She was careful to frame it as a simple request for clarification, citing relevant statutes without legal jargon. When Mrs. Washington presented the letter to the lending company, they quickly backed down, offering to renegotiate the terms. Word spread quickly through the community. Soon, Sarah found herself spending her evenings and weekends helping neighbors with various legal documents: lease agreements, employment contracts, insurance claims. She transformed her kitchen into an unofficial legal aid center, though she was always careful to present herself as a document assistant rather than a legal advisor. To maintain discretion, she established a system. Ruby would screen initial requests, ensuring that Sarah only took on cases involving document review and preparation. She never appeared in court or identified herself as anything more than a helpful neighbor who was good with paperwork. Yet her impact was undeniable. One case particularly tested her resolve. Marcus Turner, a young mechanic, came to her with a workplace injury claim that had been repeatedly denied. Sarah recognized the pattern: the company was using technical filing requirements to avoid responsibility. "Mr. Turner," she said, examining his paperwork at her kitchen table, "the issue isn't your injury. It's how the claim was filed. Let me show you how to organize these documents properly." Over several evenings, she helped him reconstruct his claim, carefully documenting every medical visit, every communication with his employer, every detail that strengthened his case. When Marcus finally received his compensation, he brought Sarah a cake his mother had baked. "You've got the gift," he told her. "You see through all the fancy words to what's right." But success brought its own challenges. As more people sought her help, Sarah had to be increasingly careful about maintaining her cover at Harrison Schmidt. She developed an elaborate system of coding her community work to look like personal correspondence, and she never kept client documents in her apartment for more than a day. The strain of her double life intensified when she began noticing patterns in the cases coming to her kitchen table: predatory lending, housing discrimination, workplace safety violations. The same issues kept recurring, often involving the same companies. She started keeping a secret ledger, documenting the patterns she observed, building a silent case against systemic injustice. In June 1954, when the Supreme Court announced its decision in Brown v. Board of Education, Sarah's community erupted in celebration. That evening, as people gathered in the streets, Sarah sat in her kitchen with a young couple, fighting a discriminatory housing practice. "Things are changing," the husband said hopefully, gesturing to the newspaper headline about the Supreme Court decision. "Yes," Sarah replied, "but change needs people willing to fight for it, one page at a time." Her reputation in the community grew, though not in the way she had initially imagined. She became known not just for her legal knowledge, but for her discretion, her patience, and her ability to explain complex legal concepts in simple terms. People began calling her Miss Sarah, speaking her name with a respect usually reserved for attorneys. One evening, as she helped a group of small business owners understand their rights under new city regulations, Sarah realized she had inadvertently created something powerful: a network of informed citizens who could better advocate for themselves. She began organizing informal education sessions, teaching people how to read contracts, understand their rights, and navigate basic legal procedures. These kitchen table seminars, as Ruby jokingly called them, became a cornerstone of community empowerment. But her work didn't go entirely unnoticed by the larger world. In late summer, she received an unexpected visit from Benjamin Taylor, a respected black attorney who had his own small practice in Brooklyn. "I've been hearing about you, Mrs. Johnson," he said, sitting at her kitchen table. "People talk about the woman in Harlem who helps them understand their papers." Sarah's heart raced, but she kept her composure. "I just help people organize their documents, Mr. Taylor. Nothing more." He smiled knowingly. "There's a difference between practicing law without a license and helping people understand their rights. You seem to walk that line very carefully." Before leaving, he left her his card. "If you ever want to discuss the law more formally, my door is open." That night, Sarah added his card to her growing collection of legal contacts, sensing that she had gained an important ally. Her community work was more than just helping with documents, it was building bridges between the formal legal world and those who had been excluded from it. As autumn approached, Sarah looked at her kitchen table, scarred from countless cups of coffee, and waited with the stories of hundreds of neighbors seeking justice. She had created something unique. A space where the law became accessible, where complex legal documents transformed into tools for justice, where her community could find not just assistance, but empowerment. In her journal that night, she wrote, "The law lives in every house, every street, every heart that beats for justice. Sometimes it just needs someone to translate its language into the rhythm of everyday life." Her journey was far from over, but she had found her true calling, not just studying the law, but making it work for those who needed it most. The winter of 1954 brought more than just cold winds to Harlem. For Sarah Johnson, it brought a moment of decision. Benjamin Taylor's business card had sat in her drawer for months, seeming to whisper possibilities every time she opened it. Finally, on a freezing December evening, she made the call. "Mr. Taylor, this is Sarah Johnson. I wonder if that offer to discuss the law more formally is still open." Their meeting in his Brooklyn office the following Saturday would change the course of her life. Taylor's office was nothing like Harrison Schmidt. It was small, cramped, and the law books showed signs of heavy use rather than decorative purpose. But it felt more real, more alive. "I've done some checking on you, Mrs. Johnson," Taylor said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Howard University graduate, top of your class. 3 years at Harrison Schmidt, where you've developed quite a reputation for filing efficiency, and now I hear you're running some kind of unofficial legal aid service from your kitchen." Sarah sat perfectly still, her own coffee untouched. "Relax," he smiled. "I'm not here to expose you. I'm here to help you take the next step. Have you considered taking the bar exam?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Of course she had considered it. It was the dream that kept her up at night, the goal that drove every hour of study. But the barriers seemed insurmountable. "Mr. Taylor, I haven't attended law school." "No, but New York is one of the few states that still allows law office apprenticeship as an alternative path to the bar. It's rarely used, and even more rarely successful, but it exists." He leaned forward. "I've spoken with some colleagues. We're willing to officially register you as an apprentice, backdating it to cover your time at Harrison Schmidt. It's irregular, but legal." Sarah's heart raced. "But my position at the firm." "You'll need to leave Harrison Schmidt," Taylor admitted. "It's too risky to stay. I can offer you a position here officially as a legal secretary, unofficially as an apprentice. The pay will be much less, but—" "I'll take it," Sarah said without hesitation. The next few months were a blur of transitions. Leaving Harrison Schmidt required careful timing and a cover story about caring for an ill relative. Some of the attorneys seemed genuinely sorry to see her go. Others barely noticed. Mr. Friedman, the junior partner who had left marked cases on her desk, gave her a knowing look on her last day. "Whatever you're planning, Mrs. Johnson, "I hope it works out," he said quietly, slipping her a card with his private number. Taylor's firm became her new home, and her real education began. By day, she maintained her cover as a secretary, but every lunch hour and evening was filled with intensive study. Taylor and his network of allied attorneys, Black, Jewish, and a few progressive whites, took turns tutoring her. The bar exam became her Mount Everest. Sarah created a meticulous study schedule, breaking down each subject into manageable chunks. Constitutional law on Mondays, contracts on Tuesdays, criminal law on Wednesdays. Every day had its focus, every hour its purpose. Her kitchen table study sessions now took on a new intensity. Ruby would quiz her late into the night, using flashcards they had carefully prepared. The community work continued, but on a more limited scale, each case now becoming a practical application of her studies. "You're living history," Ruby told her one night, watching her sisters surrounded by study materials. "When you pass this exam, you're not just becoming a lawyer. You're breaking down a wall." The pressure was enormous. Sarah knew that her success or failure would affect not just her own future, but the aspirations of others who might follow. She began having anxiety dreams about the exam, waking up reciting civil procedure rules into her pillow. In March 1955, Taylor arranged for her to take a practice exam under real conditions. The results were devastating. She failed by a significant margin. "This is normal," Taylor assured her. "The bar exam isn't just about knowledge, it's about strategy. Let's break down where you went wrong." They spent weeks analyzing her practice exam, identifying patterns in her mistakes, developing techniques for time management. Sarah learned to read questions backwards, to look for key words that changed everything, to trust her instincts while verifying her answers. The actual bar exam was scheduled for July 1955. As the date approached, Sarah's preparation reached a fever pitch. She took a leave of absence from Taylor's firm, converting her apartment into a full-time study center. Ruby moved in with friends to give her space, though she still came by daily with food and encouragement. The 2 days of the exam were a blur of questions, anxiety, and focused concentration. Sarah entered the examination room each morning, walking past the curious and sometimes hostile stares of other candidates. She was the only black woman in the room, and one of only 3 women total. "Remember," she whispered to herself, "you've been preparing for this your entire life." When it was over, the waiting began. Weeks stretched into months, as summer faded into autumn. Sarah returned to work at Taylor's firm, trying to lose herself in routine tasks, while fighting the constant temptation to second-guess every answer she had given. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in October. Sarah stared at the envelope for a full hour before opening it, her hands trembling so badly that Ruby had to hold it steady. "Dear Mrs. Johnson, we are pleased to inform you." The screams of joy that erupted from their apartment brought neighbors running. Soon, the whole building was celebrating, though most didn't fully understand what they were celebrating. That evening, as the impromptu party wound down, Sarah sat alone at her kitchen table, the table that had been her law school, her office, her fortress of solitude. She traced its scratches and coffee stains with her fingers, each mark a reminder of the journey. Taylor called to congratulate her. "You've done something remarkable," he said, "but the real work is just beginning." Sarah looked at her reflection in the window, seeing not just herself but all the women who had been denied this path, all the dreams that had been deferred. She had done more than pass an exam, she had opened the door that could never be fully closed again. In her journal that night, she wrote, "Today, I became what they said I couldn't be. Tomorrow, I help others do the same." The words were simple, but they contained a universe of promise, determination, and hope. As she prepared for bed, Sarah caught sight of the old filing notes she had kept from Harrison Schmidt, now historical documents of her secret education. She had transformed from a hidden student of the law into its official interpreter, but she knew this was just another beginning. The real test would be what she did with this hard-won power. The spring of 1956 brought change to Harlem. Cherry blossoms dotted the streets near Marcus Garvey Park, and a small storefront on 125th Street bore a new sign. Sarah Johnson, attorney at law. The golden letters gleamed in the morning sun, each one representing years of struggle, determination, and dreams. The office was modest, just 2 rooms above a bakery, but to Sarah, it was a palace of possibility. She had saved every penny from her work at Taylor's firm, supplementing it with loans from community members who believed in her vision. The furniture was secondhand, the law books carefully collected over years, but the spirit of the place was palpable. "You know what this means, don't you?" Ruby said, helping her arrange the desk on opening day. "You're not just opening a law office. You're making history." Sarah nodded, touching the framed bar admission certificate on the wall. "This isn't just my office, Ruby. It's our community's office." Word spread quickly through Harlem's grapevine. Many of the people who had once sought help at her kitchen table now came to her proper office, bringing not just their legal troubles but their trust. Sarah maintained the same careful, methodical approach that had served her well during her secret years, but now she could fight openly for justice. Her first major case came unexpectedly. Reverend James Wallace from her church approached her about a group of black teachers who had been systematically denied promotions in the city's public schools. The case was complex, involving patterns of discrimination carefully hidden behind bureaucratic procedures. "Most lawyers wouldn't touch this," Reverend Wallace warned. "It's too big, too controversial." Sarah smiled, remembering all the time she had typed up similar dismissals at Harrison Schmidt. "Then it's exactly the kind of case we need to take." She threw herself into the work, drawing on both her legal training and her years of document analysis. Nights found her at her office desk, surrounded by personnel files, school board minutes, and statistical analyses. She developed a novel legal theory, arguing that the pattern of discrimination violated both state law and the principles established in Brown v. Board of Education. The case, Wallace v. New York City Board of Education, became her baptism by fire. Opposing counsel from the city's legal department initially treated her with dismissive condescension, which turned to surprise and then respect as she methodically built her case. In court, Sarah faced not just legal opposition, but the weight of tradition. The jury selection alone took weeks, as she fought to ensure a fair representation. When she rose to deliver her opening statement, she felt the eyes of history upon her. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, her voice clear and steady, "this case is about more than promotions. It's about the fundamental American promise that ability and dedication should determine our opportunities, not the color of our skin." The trial lasted 6 weeks. Sarah worked tirelessly, often sleeping on the office couch, sustained by Ruby's food deliveries and the prayers of her community. She cross-examined witnesses with surgical precision, her years of silent observation at Harrison Schmidt having taught her to spot evasion and half-truths. The victory, when it came, was sweeping. The court ordered not just back pay for the affected teachers, but systematic changes in the promotion process. The decision made headlines, and Sarah's phone began ringing with calls from civil rights organizations across the country. But success brought its own challenges. As her reputation grew, so did the threats. Anonymous letters appeared at her office, windows were broken, and unpleasant late-night phone calls became routine. Sarah refused to be intimidated, installing better locks but never curtailing her work. By the end of 1956, she had hired her first assistant, a young black woman named Gloria Martinez, who reminded Sarah of herself at Howard University. "I want to learn everything," Gloria said during her interview. "Not just the law, but how to use it to make real change." Sarah's practice evolved beyond individual cases to address systematic inequities. She began organizing legal workshops, teaching community members about their rights and how to assert them. Her office became a hub for civil rights activism, though she always insisted on working through legal channels. One evening, as she prepared for another major discrimination case, Benjamin Taylor visited her office. "You built something remarkable here," he said, looking around at the busy space that had once been an empty room above a bakery. "We've built something," Sarah corrected him. "None of us succeed alone." That night, after everyone had gone home, Sarah stood at her office window, looking out over Harlem. The street below was alive with activity, families returning from work, children playing, elderly couples taking evening walks. These were the people she fought for, the community that had sustained her through years of secret study and public struggle. She thought about the young girl who had once stood on the courthouse steps, dreaming of justice. That dream had evolved into something larger than personal ambition. It had become a mission to open doors for others, to prove that the law could be a tool for positive change. In her diary that night, she wrote, "The law is like a light. It can cast shadows when misused, but in the right hands, it illuminates the path to justice. Our task is not just to learn the law, but to ensure its light reaches every corner of our community." The next morning, Sarah arrived early at her office, as was her habit. As she unlocked the door, she noticed a young black girl standing across the street, staring at the sign with wonder. Their eyes met, and Sarah smiled, recognizing in the girl's gaze the same dream that had driven her own journey. "Would you like to come in?" she called out. "I could tell you about what lawyers do." The girl's face lit up as she crossed the street. Sarah opened the door, not just to her office, but to a future of possibilities. As they sat together, Sarah began to share her story, knowing that each word was a seed planted in fertile ground, each moment an investment in dreams yet to unfold. Outside, the morning sun continued to rise over Harlem, its light catching the golden letters of her name, a beacon of hope and change in a world that was, slowly but surely, beginning to transform.